Welcome to Feeling This Life. We're a family support podcast that dives deep into the triumphs, challenges, and strategies that are part of the lives of those who care for young children with blindness and visual impairment. I'm Paige Maynard, and I'm a teacher of the visually impaired and early interventionist at VIPS, Visually Impaired Preschool Services.
And I'm Dr. Cathy Smith, an independent research consultant at Anchor Center for Blind Children.
I'm Jenny Castanier. I'm the Family Services Coordinator at VIPS. I am the mother of 3 girls, and my youngest has a visual impairment. I'm excited to bring you an interview with Carol Dahmke. Carol is the HR Manager and IT Coordinator at VIPS. She is the mother of 3 and grandmother of 5. She and her husband have raised 2 sons with a visual impairment, has a grandson with a visual impairment, and grew up with her father having a visual impairment. Welcome, Carol. I'm so excited you're here.
Oh, thank you, Jenny. I feel so honored to be interviewed.
As we talked about in the intro, you clearly have had a lot of experience with vision and your personal life, and then as well your professional life working at VIPS. Tell us your story. Tell me about yourself, your life.
So, as you mentioned, my dad had a visual impairment, and I never knew growing up what that was, or Dad didn't really talk about it. Dad was the athletic director. He was the boys' coach of all the different sports, and was also a teacher and an O&M instructor at the Nebraska school. He worked for over 30 years and then even worked part-time kind of after retirement. So I kind of just grew up in that whole world. So to me, that was just the norm. And as I got older, Dad sometimes would come in and say, "Okay, Carol, I need you to come in and check and see if what I've picked out to wear today, does it match?" And I also remember reading the Sunday sports section growing up in Nebraska, and back in the days of great Nebraska football with Bob Devaney and Tom Osborne, I always had to read whatever was in the sports section that had anything to do with the most recent football game. So they'd play on a Saturday. So Sunday morning, I knew what I was going to be doing part of the day, would be reading, word for word, which in a lot of ways it was good for me because I learned how to pronounce new words every so often. I became pretty fluent as far as reading. And my dad did not drive. I think he chose not to, but I feel like he probably could have if there would have been like a bioptic driving program, because both of our boys went through that and drove. So growing up, I had just as many friends over at the school where Dad worked. At that time, it was called the Nebraska School for the Visually Handicapped. My mom was a Girl Scout leader when I was younger, and so a lot of the girls that were in my brownies were visually impaired or blind, and then also a few of my friends from elementary school.
It seems like you had a very normal childhood. Your dad worked. It sounds like he was part of the family in every sense. It's not something that divided your family or made it hard for you to live with. Do you agree with that statement?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was neat because it also gave some of my friends, it gave them opportunities to also learn and be around anyone that's put in a new situation, or they've not been around someone, whether it's blindness, visual impairment, deaf, hard of hearing, cerebral, whatever that challenge is. It typically, I think, makes you feel more comfortable in the situation. You're more comfortable talking and visiting and chatting with that person or whomever you're meeting. And so a lot of my friends, that kind of became fairly normal for them, really.
Moving forward into your life, when we talk about your sons that were visually impaired, how did that compare to your dad? Even though you were used to it, familiar with it, was there a bigger sense of fear or stress or anything with it being your children?
Definitely. Our daughter was born first, and typical baby and no issues, didn't think anything of it, kind of what you expect. And then our son came along because they're 18 months apart in age, and didn't really notice anything right away. But by about 2 months, I started noticing some eye movement. I didn't really know what it was, but we always had like a little musical mobile over their crib, and I would watch him, and it was like you could tell he was seeing something, but he'd be turning his head or his eyes would get to moving more, and I thought, I don't know, something's not quite right. This is not what Ashley did when she was a baby. I really feel like he's having a hard time seeing it. And it was just like, uh, you get that sinking feeling, because I don't even think at that point if I even thought, oh, this could be something my dad has. I wasn't even thinking that. I was just focused on, oh my gosh, what's wrong with my baby? So I talked right away to my doctor, our general practitioner, and I'm telling him about it. And he said, well, I think we need to call and get him checked out. And at that time, we were in Wyoming. Well, Wyoming didn't have any pediatric ophthalmologists. There weren't a lot of them. And the closest was either going to be in Colorado or Nebraska. And so since I was from Nebraska, we found a pediatric ophthalmologist in Omaha, which is clear on the other end of the state. So not a short drive. But anyway, we weren't going to be able to get in for a while, being a new patient. Meanwhile, our doctor was trying to help wherever he could. I'm on the phone crying and stressing out. And so he talked to a local optometrist, and that ended up being a mistake. He saw Chris, immediately said, well, to do an eye exam, him being a little baby, he's going to have to be put under general anesthesia to be thoroughly examined. And I think he could be blind. And it was like, what? I mean, it was like, that just upset me even more. I mean, I called my doctor right after that, and I'm really crying at that point and freaking out. And he's Carol, I'm so sorry. I made a mistake. You probably just need to wait until you can go and see the specialist. So we went, and of course, no, that was not the case. Pediatric ophthalmologist was able to check his vision without having to put him under, and kind of went from there. And then that's kind of when the connection of, well, my dad's visually impaired, but I don't know what his diagnosis is. And but we did find out that he had pendular nystagmus. So the whole thing with the eye movement. But later on, when both of them got older, I remember they both had to have CAT scans with contrast, because they had told us, they said there is a chance that it could be caused by a brain tumor, which it's like, oh my God. Well, it wasn't. So that was kind of the initial introduction, and realizing that the boys were visually impaired. And that was so much scarier than growing up with my dad, because my dad was already grown, independent, self-sufficient. But now here we've got two boys, and they're both visually impaired. That was just so scary, other than the fact that I kept telling myself, you know what? I remember my dad went to Kentucky School for the Blind at a fairly young age, and look at him now. So I knew it was going to be a process. Mitch was probably, I would say, without him really totally admitting it, he was a lot more frightened than I was, because he was not familiar with what I was familiar with.
I think that this is a neat part of your story too, having the two boys with a visual impairment. And am I correct that it's the same diagnosis for both?
Yes,
Okay.
except that Brett's was probably maybe weakened. So his visual impairment was a little different than Chris's. It was basically the same diagnosis, but his visual acuity was typically better than Chris's, and his nystagmus wasn't near as obvious either. But it took us years to get a diagnosis because it turned out my dad was never diagnosed properly.
Oh, wow.
I asked Dad, is there any way you could find out from your ophthalmologist what your diagnosis is? And he kind of drug his feet with that a little bit. I felt like Dad felt guilty because his two grandsons were visually impaired. And I think he felt like it's my fault. And, and I would tell Dad, it's like, Dad, it's okay, but their doctor needs to know what your diagnosis was. It would really help. And then once Dad found out what his diagnosis was, I wrote it down, took it in at our next appointment, and I was told, well, unfortunately, that's not a diagnosis. He said it was like they took this piece and this piece and put these two diagnoses together and they conflict. He said, so that's okay. We're just going to start with a clean slate. And that's when they went through a few more tests that he felt like were more appropriate that confirmed X-linked cone dystrophy. They were teenagers at that point. Definitely a journey getting there, but learned a whole lot.
I know you and I know of your family. I haven't met all of them, but I know your life, and it would be what someone looking in would say, oh, that's normal. I had no idea all this was going on. So tell me about their early childhood. What was that like?
We didn't have early intervention at that time in Nebraska. I didn't even know of such a thing. So it was just us trying to do what we thought was right. Chris was very active and had no fear, it seemed like. I remember when Chris started trying to walk, and he was 9 months probably, and he would just kind of fall. And I learned real quick that he wasn't always seeing if there was something in the way. So you'd have end tables, or you'd have the little cabinet where the TV was. And that was back, you had like the heavy, deep TVs, and he loved to climb. So we had a variety of little mishaps that he was always so fortunate and would get out of the way quick enough somehow and didn't get hurt. Then we had Brett. They were almost 3 years apart. So Brett's probably 6 weeks old, and I had brought him out to the living room, and Chris was playing, and I went into the bedroom to get something. I come back out, and Chris has picked up his baby brother. And I'm like calmly not saying anything because I didn't want to scare him. I wasn't going to, oh my God, put him down. So I walk up to him, and it's like, it's going to be fine. I'll just take him out of his arms and I'll take the baby. Well, visually impaired, but doesn't see things until he's fairly close to it. Mm-hmm. Well, all of a sudden, he apparently saw me getting closer to him. That was enough to, I think, scare him, and he drops Brett on the floor. Luckily, it was carpeted, which scares me to death. Thankfully, babies are resilient. I mean, in our minds, in a lot of ways, it was normal. We just knew there were times we had to tweak something or We were learning that he wasn't seeing things unless it was in front of him. Whereas Brett, it was a little different. He could see better at a distance. Chris's vision, oh, even his personality, everything. He is so much my dad. I had learned from a geneticist that more than likely our daughter Ashley had a 50% chance of being a carrier. Hence, her second born son, Tyler, has a visual impairment. But glasses help him. It's so interesting that certain things are so similar because he also has some pendular nystagmus. That was one of the things that Ashley and I both picked up on when he was about 2 months old.
As they moved into elementary years, would you consider it to kind of be like your dad, where you felt like things were fairly what people might consider normal, going to school, involved in activities, friendships, things like that?
So being in preschool, I felt like definitely helped. And I talked to the preschool teacher, so she was aware of things. And so she did what she thought was the best. And again, we didn't have any kind of early intervention. And because they were both August babies and being boys, and then the visual impairment on top of that, we waited until they were turning 6 to go to kindergarten, which really was good for our youngest, for Brett, because he could have cared less the first year of preschool. He just wanted to go and have fun and play with the other kids. He really didn't care about learning the alphabet. He didn't care about, and it was the second year, all of a sudden the light bulb went on, and it was like, oh, okay, well, yeah, I don't mind doing this now. And he ended up doing just fine. Then getting into elementary school, a lot of people didn't necessarily even know that either one of the boys was visually impaired because they would be out on the playground and getting around pretty well. Kindergarten, you've got big font, so that wasn't an issue. Neither one of them had a problem in kindergarten. First grade, it got a little smaller, but first grade really wasn't even an issue. But we noticed with Chris, as he kept going up in the grades, he did not like being singled out, and he was needing to sit up front. We did have a teacher of the visually impaired, but she served the whole panhandle of Nebraska. She had a caseload of about 90 kids. She saw our boys once a year. She'd observe them for about 30 minutes. And then we would have our ARC meetings that same day while she was there. And she would write up the IEP and try to ensure that they were getting what they needed. And it was kind of working, but because Chris was getting more and more sensitive and he was getting to where he did not like having to go to school, it was like, we're going to have to do something. And it was when Mitch was one of the 6th grade teachers, had a student at that time that was deaf, and they had a professor come and speak to the teachers and the staff so that everyone could try and support this student as much as possible. And Mitch came home that day after the professor had come and talked, and he said, Carol, I was listening to him, and when he said, if you live somewhere where you don't have the services that your child needs or an adult, you need to move where those services are. That this is important. You want them to have a good foundation. This is going to carry them through the rest of their life. And it was like, okay, well, that makes sense, but where are we going to go? And of course, I mean, it made sense. My dad was from Kentucky. He'd attended Kentucky School for the Blind since the age of 9. Look at where my dad was. He went on to the University of Louisville, So we made a trip back and we took a tour of KSB. We went over and did a tour at APH, I remember. And the whole time, Chris was upset at times because he was like, I don't want to move. I have my friends. I don't want to move. I don't like this. And he didn't want to have anything to do with any of that. So that was upsetting. And of course, our daughter, who was going to get ready to go into seventh grade, and she was doing great in sports. And we're talking about moving for the next school year. And we went ahead and did it. But to help her in that process of making such a big transition, moving across the country, once we looked at the communities around Louisville, I did homework and we had it down from Shelby County and Spencer County. And so our daughter made the final decision. I gave her all the information I had found on both counties. And I said, Ashley, I know this is going to be a hard move for you, and I am so sorry, but this is important and we need to do it because your brothers deserve a good education like you're getting. And so she chose where we were going to move to, and it was Spencer County.
Well, I love that you empowered her to do that and make that huge decision for you all.
Yeah, I felt like that was the only thing we could do. I just felt like we had to do something to give her, at least she had some kind of a choice in this whole big situation.
Talking about your daughter, and you mentioned that her youngest son has the diagnosis as well. Just a very unique scenario where you grew up with it, but then it was still scary with your son, still so much to learn. I mean, I imagine that there's still a sense of fear, or I don't know, maybe there's not when you're so used to it. How did your daughter feel? How did you feel? What was that like?
Well, if I remember correctly, just prior to that 2 month checkup, I had mentioned to her what I was observing with Tyler. And she hesitated, but if she had to admit it, she noticed it also. The pediatrician was wonderful, and she agreed that this was something that needed to get checked out. And so he got referred to a pediatric ophthalmologist and went from there. You know, she was a sibling and used to being around her brothers. And I mean, they're like typical young men that just happen to have a visual impairment. And I feel like she was probably a little better prepared. But again, it's hard when all of a sudden now it's your child and you've got that big responsibility and something you're going to have to learn all about, and it's coming from a different place versus she didn't have to worry about it necessarily growing up with her brothers. Our grandson, he is very active. He's 10 now and smart, doing great in school. And one thing that's really neat to see with him is how empowered he is, because we had the VIP support, but his TBI has been great. And he's had the same TBI since he started in kindergarten. He's got his own little pack that sits on the back of his chair that's got all of his little tools and things he might need. And he makes sure the other kids know that's his and you don't bother it. He has a whole different attitude versus Chris when I think back on it. But he learned early on between the twos class and preschool and his TBI working with him that this is his norm and these are his tools in his toolbox that help him to succeed. It's neat to see what that difference is.
What is something that you wish that someone would have told you in advance about being a mother or a grandmother to a child with a visual impairment?
To read, to learn as much as you can, but also take advantage of meeting other parents or grandparents. When you're meeting other parents, there's great support, networking, resources. It's just awesome.
What a great interview, Jenny. Thanks for doing that for us. It was really interesting to hear. I want to start today, and because it was really hard for me to find something to look into the research, and I want to point this out because I think there's been some buzz lately in the community that research isn't really important, and it just so is, because I thought, great, I'll go look and see what the research is on families, people who have family members who have visual impairments and what that was like growing up, and there's nothing. So if somebody knows of something, please send it to us or email us and tell us. But I looked and looked and looked, and I was very disappointed there wasn't anything about that. So instead, I chose to kind of look at the research that there is on early intervention in visual impairment. So there's not a lot. There's been several studies over the years, and somebody, doctoral student in Italy, Micheletta is her name, she did a review of research studies on the effectiveness of early intervention in visual impairment. So that's a great article for us to have, and kind of mixed reviews. So the results of that review is that we don't have a lot of great studies on implementation of early intervention, so we need to work on that. Yeah, we need to work on that as a field.
Interesting.
So we're getting better at looking at assessments, and we in the broader field of early childhood, we know that early intervention is very important. And I think we know that in visual impairment too, but we don't have proof. We don't have research. But the studies that they looked at that were the best, the pieces that were most important, and I think Carol spoke to this, even though she didn't receive early intervention, she looked at this for her children, and her daughter is getting early intervention and how that can benefit, and how VIPS supported them when they needed it. So the pieces of early intervention that are really important are, it says, implementation should be by modifying and enriching the natural infant environment. So we know that means, going into the home, helping families make decisions about how to make that environment more accessible, and thinking about routines, all that stuff that we know is very important. Promoting early social interaction, which I think is huge, and Carol even talked about that a bit, how one of her children was super social and the other one not so much, and how they had to adapt things differently for them. And then providing opportunities for multisensory experiences in that family play-based way. So kind of active play and engaging the family as part of that. So I think those are things that we all do. We just need to work a little bit harder at proving it. Like, we need to do a study where we look at that implementation and how it benefits everybody.
Yeah. I like the component of that was the social piece, because one of the things that Carol said that her grandson is so successful at is advocating for himself.
Yes.
And if I think back to what I experienced with him whenever he was in our preschool program, the social interaction piece of him making friends and being able to ask for what he wanted from an adult, and all of those things that are around those social skills, I see now for him in what she shared with him as now he's in elementary school, that now he's able to kind of talk about what he needs. And I wonder about the connection between those two things,
Yeah.
like that social focus on social skills early on for him and early intervention. Like, how has that helped him for advocacy now that he's such a good advocate for himself? What do you guys think?
I think that's huge, just coming from an early age. When I think about my daughter, she has fairly good advocating skills. That being said, entering into the time when you don't want to be different from your peers. But she's been advocating for herself from a young age. And that was from VIPS, teaching her this is what you need and why, and this is how to explain it. But not only that, it educated my husband and I too, as to it's okay to ask for these things, and you can explain if needed why you need it. And it just made me feel more comfortable with it, because we almost got to practice at those young ages. And then now that she really needs it, it's kind of like second nature.
Nice.
Oh, that's really cool. The practice that you got
Yeah.
and that she got whenever she was really young, and then now it being like, all right, I'm here and I'm really ready and I need all of these things, or things like that she can ask for and that you guys feel more comfortable to ask about.
Well, and one of the things it said in this study was that some of the studies didn't do well was we don't have great assessments, but I know there are assessments that we can use now. So I don't know about when these studies were taking place, but there are assessments that we can use to look at change across time, specifically with parent infant caregiver interactions, using things like the PICCOLO and assessments like that. So we have that ability. We just have to try to figure out a way to do it.
Yeah. Tell us more about the PICCOLO. I'm curious.
The PICCOLO, I knew you were going to ask me this. So actually it's a great assessment. It is not specifically for kids who are visual impaired, but all you have to do is do a recording of parent and child, or grandparent and child, whoever you choose to do it, and you record for 10 minutes. There's 4 areas that encourage kids or encourage parents to. There's affection, teaching is the last one, encouragement, and responsiveness. So there's different items in that, and that some of them are very appropriate for kids with visual impairment. Like one of them is, how well does the parent explain characteristics of objects, which is perfect, right? And there's one about wait time and all those things that we talk about, and being close by. And it's been validated on thousands of kids with and without disabilities. So it's a good assessment.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, here's also a question while we're talking about PICCOLO. So, like, Jenny, if this was you and Hannah whenever you were younger, how would it make you feel to be on video and have somebody looking at the way you're interacting with your infant or toddler?
I think it would take me a while to get used to it. And I think it would take several times before I was actually natural and not being super self-conscious. Not that I would be performing for the camera, but I would probably I'd be doing what I normally would do, but I would know someone's watching me and it would probably look awkward. It would take me a while.
And I think that's true. I think we do see that occasionally, but it's not like we grade them tough, It's not like, oh, you didn't do this one little thing. It's not like that. And here's the good thing. So I highly recommend that teachers of all kinds do observations. And this is an opportunity for the TVI to observe the parent interacting with the child, and then you can watch it back together. It's just 10 minutes, and talk about, how do you feel about that? How do you, how did that go? Is there something you would do differently? So Paige knows about this, because this is kind of what we did in the MRVI study. Yeah. So, and we used the PICCOLO in that as well. So I've been using it for a long time. It's a good thing. So let's go back and talk about Carol. I think we got off track. Right. So,
well, Jenny, your answer to how you might feel if you were having someone video you for the PICCOLO was it sounded like you might have a little bit of anxiety, which hopefully we've comforted you a little bit that it'll all be okay. But it reminded me of the anxiety and the panic and the stress and the fear that Carol experienced when she was wondering if her boys were impacted by blindness and low vision. So I just thought that was just such an interesting way that kind of her story played out, that she had grown up her whole life with people who were blind. Her dad had low vision. He worked at the school for the blind. All of these things, but just how normal that it is that she had that same response that every single one of our families has as they're kind of grappling with some of these things that are happening.
Yeah, and that's why I asked the question about her daughter as well. Like, how did her daughter feel and how did she feel about her grandson? Because once I heard her say that about her boys, I really wanted for families to hear it's okay. Because you're scared, that's not a problem. It's a problem if you're scared and you don't move forward and find next steps. But it's completely normal to be scared. And I think that proved it because Carol, she said, I had a normal upbringing, what you would consider normal, but she was still scared. And then she was still scared years later. And I just wanted families to hear that and just kind of acknowledge it within themselves, like give themselves grace. It's okay to be scared. It's okay if things don't look the way you thought they were going to.
For sure. And because it sounds like she had fantastic role models, right? We always talk about we need to share with families examples of successful adults who have visual impairments, who are doing okay. But even having that in her childhood and her whole life, she still had that anxiety. So it's just going to happen. It's part of the society that we live in, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're human, and it's okay to give ourselves permission to be human. We, maybe if we would have asked her if she were to remove herself from the situation, which I know that would be difficult to do, but to ask her, like, hey, if you had grown up with, being in this community and then you realized that you also were going to have another role within it as a parent, do you think that you would feel anxiety over it? And, maybe she would say no or yes, I don't know. But like just giving yourself permission to just be a person, because it can be really scary. She knows what her experience was being the daughter of someone who had a visual impairment, but there's so much unexpected whenever you're the parent of a child who has a visual impairment, and navigating all of the parts of that, I imagine, could bring a lot of unknowns. And some of those can really, I know a lot of the families that I work with, they talk about how you just don't know what to expect. And this is a plug for our season 1 of what to expect feeling this life. So we've got a couple episodes there for you to listen to. Yeah, it's okay to be human.
Yeah, and she even talked about how, once they had a diagnosis, and even as they were growing up and she was kind of getting the hang of what was going on, that her kids were different. They had different things that they needed. Their vision, while it was the same diagnosis, it affected them differently. And I just felt so overwhelmed for her because I was thinking about my one kid and all the notes I have in my phone that I need to remember and address. And I was thinking to myself, oh my gosh, if I had 2 kids, I would literally just have to give up and like make a handout and just give it to everyone I know. Like this is your handout. You take that wherever you go. Because I can't imagine trying to remember both.
Yeah, I bet that was really hard.
Everybody's an individual. Just because you have the same diagnosis doesn't mean you're going to act the same way. So, and that's a good thing.
That's right.
Differences are good. So,
I feel like Carol has 1,000 more stories she could probably share with us. She was really fun to interview, and I really enjoyed it.
We enjoyed listening, and maybe Carol will be a guest again.
Yes.
fingers crossed.
Thank you so much for listening to Feeling This Life. Did you know that this podcast is actually part of a research study? By filling out the survey in the show notes, you can help our community learn more about how podcasts impact those who care for children who are blind and visually impaired. So please take a look when you're able. Also, if you'd like to support us in making more episodes of Feeling This Life, look for the donation link in the show notes. The show notes also include links to resources related to today's episode and ways to get in contact with us. Please join us again next time for another episode of Feeling This Life.